Welcome to Relax Story, a peaceful place where gentle stories help you leave behind the worries of the day and drift into a calm, restful sleep. Each soothing narration is designed to relax your mind, ease tension, and bring a sense of comfort and peace. If you enjoy listening, please like and subscribe, and feel free to share your thoughts or story suggestions in the comments. Now, close your eyes, take a slow, deep breath, and let Relax Story guide you into a night of deep and peaceful sleep. In August 2001, Enron was valued by the market at nearly $70 billion. It was one of the largest energy companies in the United States, ranked 7th in the industry, and was frequently held up as a symbol of the American economy in the aftermath of the internet boom. Investors saw the company as a model of the future. Business schools featured Enron in lessons on innovation. The media praised it as proof that America had entered an entirely new era. 4 months later, Enron filed for bankruptcy. There was no war devastating the economy, no global recession sweeping through the markets, no natural disaster powerful enough to cripple business operations. There was no oil shock that brought the entire energy sector to its knees. What disappeared was not just a company. What disappeared was the faith of millions of people in the numbers they had been looking at for years. Numbers that had been treated as evidence of success, innovation, and the future itself. How could the most celebrated company in America collapse so quickly? What really existed behind that empire? To answer those questions, we need to go back a few years, to a time when Enron was still seen as the embodiment of the American economic dream. In the late 1990s, Houston stood at the heart of the American energy industry. The city was synonymous with giant oil and gas corporations, pipeline networks stretching for thousands of miles, and oil fields spread across the southern United States. But the times were changing. The internet had created a belief that every industry could be reinvented. Old limitations seemed to be fading away. In that atmosphere, energy was no longer viewed simply as natural gas or electricity. It began to be seen as a financial asset that could be bought, priced, and traded in countless new ways. At the center of Houston, the glass tower rising more than 50 stories above 1400 Smith Street stood as a symbol of that transformation. It was Enron's headquarters. To many, it represented an America convinced that technology, markets, and financial ingenuity could overcome every limit that had once existed. Enron was no longer seen as a gas company. It was seen as the future. The dot-com era created an almost endless hunger for growth. Wall Street became consumed by the search for companies capable of changing the world. Enron arrived at exactly the right moment. Financial analysts issued one optimistic assessment after another. Business publications showered the company with rare praise. Institutional investors poured money into Enron stock. Business schools increasingly treated it as the blueprint for the 21st century corporation. Enron was described as the company transforming the way the world bought and sold energy. It was seen as proof that bold ideas could be turned into extraordinary profits. Year after year, Enron was named the most innovative company in America. The title gradually became more than an award. It became a seal of perfection. The more praise the company received, The less it was questioned, the greater the confidence became. That confidence was quickly reflected in the stock price. Over the course of a decade, Enron shares climbed from just a few dollars to more than $90 per share by the year 2000. Its market value soared into the tens of billions. Reported revenue surpassed $100 billion. Thousands of employees owned company stock. Many became paper millionaires. Some placed nearly their entire retirement savings into Enron shares. They did not do it because they were forced to. They did it because they believed. That belief was not simply faith in a company. It was faith that Enron understood the future better than the rest of the world. Behind this miracle stood two men. Kenneth Lay, the company's founder and chairman, built a vast network of political relationships and transformed Enron from a regional energy business into a corporation with national influence. The other man kept a lower public profile at the time. His name was Jeffrey Skilling. Skilling brought the mindset of Wall Street into the energy industry. He championed the idea that almost anything could be turned into a tradable asset. To the outside world, he looked like a genius of the new age. Inside the company, an entirely new ideology was taking shape. From the outside, Enron looked like the perfect miracle of late 20th century capitalism, a company that was admired, a stock that was trusted, a future that seemed incapable of failure. But every miracle has someone standing behind the curtain. That person was Jeffrey Skilling. He wanted to build Enron with more than belief. He wanted to build it on arrogance. And that is where the real tragedy began. Jeffrey Skilling arrived at Enron unlike most senior executives. He did not come to maintain an existing system. He came believing that the system itself needed to be rebuilt from the ground up. People who worked with him often noticed a particular kind of confidence. It was not the confidence of a typical corporate leader. It was the certainty of someone convinced he had already seen the future before everyone else. His degree from Harvard Business School opened the door to a highly promising career. At McKinsey, Skilling quickly rose to become a senior partner. His reputation became tied to bold ideas about newly deregulated energy markets. When he joined Enron in 1990 to expand the company's business beyond the boundaries of traditional regulation, he brought more than consulting experience with him. He brought an entire worldview. To Kenneth Lay, Skilling looked like the embodiment of the future. At the time, Enron was still known primarily as a company that owned natural gas pipelines and physical energy assets. Skilling saw something different. He believed the greatest value was not hidden inside thousands of miles of pipeline. The real value lay in the ability to predict, trade, and price risk. From 1990 to 2001, America was living through a period of deep faith in free markets. The Cold War had ended. Economic barriers were gradually coming down. In many industries, government regulation was increasingly viewed as an obstacle to growth. Energy was no longer seen solely as infrastructure that powered daily life. It was becoming a massive marketplace where contracts changed hands every day. For Skilling, the market was not merely a business tool. It was almost a system of judgment. If the market rewarded a decision, that decision was considered right. If the market punished a company or an individual, the failure was viewed as proof of weakness. In that worldview, the market did not simply create prices, it created truth. From that belief, Skilling began reshaping the very nature of Enron, a company that had once earned most of its money from operating energy infrastructure, gradually transformed into a trading organization. Instead of simply moving natural gas from producers to consumers, Enron positioned itself between participants in the market. It bought, sold, and priced energy contracts. It made money from spreads, volatility, and predictions about the future. The model had a powerful appeal. Building a new pipeline could take years. Executing a trade could take minutes. Physical assets were limited by geography. Expectations had no obvious limits. The more successful Enron became, the more aggressively it extended that logic into new areas. Electricity became a tradable product. Coal became a tradable product. Paper, steel, internet bandwidth, even contracts tied to weather conditions were folded into the same approach. Once everything could be bought and sold, people inside the organization gradually came to be viewed through the same lens. Skilling built an intensely competitive culture. Enron recruited top MBA graduates from the most prestigious business schools. Ambitious young professionals entered a system where speed, boldness, and the ability to generate profits were valued above all else. Winners received enormous bonuses. Winners were rewarded with stock. Winners rose through the ranks at remarkable speed. Over time, winning became more than a professional achievement. It became proof of personal worth. The troubling part was the questions that were no longer being asked. Had those profits actually materialized? Had the cash really arrived? Did the results reflect reality? Or were they built on highly optimistic assumptions about the future? In a culture obsessed with performance, those questions attracted less and less attention. To maintain constant competitive pressure, Enron adopted a performance review system widely known as rank and yank. Employees were regularly evaluated and ranked. Those who consistently landed near the bottom faced the constant threat of being pushed out. Fear became part of the operating system. The consequences appeared quickly. Colleagues began competing more than they collaborated. Sharing information could help someone else move ahead. Supporting a coworker sometimes meant weakening your own position. An organization that once celebrated collective intelligence slowly drifted into a survival contest between individuals. This was also the period when deeper problems began taking root. Enron proudly described itself as a gathering place for the brightest minds. Yet its internal system increasingly rewarded results over honesty. People who generated revenue were celebrated. People who asked difficult questions were viewed as obstacles to progress. When an organization becomes obsessed with the final number and forgets how that number was created, the line between achievement and deception begins to blur. The seeds of disaster appeared much earlier than most people realized. They were not hidden in financial statements. They were not buried inside the complex shell companies that would emerge later. They were rooted in a simple belief that winning was always the same thing as being right. A company that places growth above reality will eventually find a way to profit from expectations. Enron found that path. Within just a few years, electricity, natural gas, and risk itself were no longer treated as ordinary commodities. They were slowly being turned into chips on a giant gambling table that America did not yet realize it had already joined. For most of the natural gas industry's history, Making money was fairly straightforward. A company built pipelines. Gas moved from where it was produced to where it was needed. Customers paid for transportation. Revenue only existed when energy physically flowed through the system. It was a stable business model, but a slow one. Every new mile of pipeline required massive capital investment. Every new facility took years to build. Every new customer added only a limited amount of revenue. Growth was ultimately constrained by the physical world. Jeffrey Skilling looked at that model and saw something that belonged to a different era. He was not fascinated by owning more pipelines or expanding infrastructure. What interested him were contracts. Not the gas flowing today, but the right to buy and sell gas in the future. The idea sounded simple enough. A business wanted to lock in energy prices for years ahead. A manufacturer wanted certainty about future operating costs. A city wanted protection from unexpected market swings. Everyone was looking for predictability. If Enron could position itself in the middle of those needs, it would not have to make money from energy itself. It could make money from the transactions surrounding energy. That was a profound difference. Natural gas is a finite commodity. Reserves are limited. Pipelines are limited. Transportation capacity is limited. Promises about future gas deliveries are different. A contract can be bought. It can be sold. It can be repriced. It can change hands multiple times before a single cubic meter of gas is ever delivered. That moment marked Enron's quiet transformation from an energy company into a company that traded expectations. The idea arrived at exactly the moment America was reshaping the way its energy industry worked. For decades, electricity and natural gas markets had been tightly regulated. Prices, operating territories, and access to infrastructure were carefully controlled. Companies largely served clearly defined regions. By the early 1990s, that picture began to change. New regulations encouraged broader competition. Geographic barriers gradually disappeared. Energy was no longer simply a product sold within local markets. It began to move through larger, more flexible, and more complex trading networks. Many people saw an expanding market. Jeffrey Skilling saw a financial market being born. If energy could be traded freely, he believed it could be treated like many other financial assets. Value no longer existed solely in the commodity itself. Value existed in the ability to predict, price, and transfer risk. From that perspective, Enron did not need to become the largest gas producer in America. It did not need to own the most power plants. It simply needed to stand at the center of the transactions. It simply needed to become the place everyone turned to when they wanted to buy or sell certainty about future energy prices. In Houston, that vision quickly became reality. Inside Enron's offices, the atmosphere increasingly resembled a financial trading floor rather than a traditional energy company. Hundreds of employees sat in front of electronic screens, streaming constant data. Phones rang without pause. Numbers changed minute by minute. Instead of monitoring pipeline pressure or production output, many employees spent their days watching price movements. A power plant wanted to secure electricity supplies for the next 10 years. Enron signed a contract. A business wanted to stabilize natural gas costs for the next 15 years. Enron signed a contract. A city wanted protection from sudden spikes in energy prices. Enron signed another contract. The company acted as intermediary, broker, and trader all at once. Profits came from price spreads, transaction fees, and an ability to assess risk better than competitors. At first, the model worked remarkably well. Revenue surged. Enron's reputation spread across Wall Street. Investors began to view the company as the blueprint for the new economy. It seemed to be a business no longer constrained by heavy physical assets, but driven by intelligence, data, and markets. That success created a new kind of pressure. From the mid-1990s through 2000, growth became the only metric that truly mattered. Every quarter had to outperform the last. Every year had to be bigger than the one before. The stock price kept climbing. Admiration grew. Expectations rose even faster. But the real world does not move at the speed of expectations. A pipeline can carry only so much gas. A power plant can generate only so much electricity. A customer can consume only so much energy. Market expectations, on the other hand, have almost no limits. Once a company is labeled a genius, it becomes very difficult for it to grow at a normal pace. That was where the gap between reality and expectation began to emerge. Physical assets continued to expand at their familiar speed. Financial contracts expanded far more rapidly. Gradually, the numbers appearing on trading screens attracted more attention than what was actually happening in the field. The value of future contracts became a bigger story than the energy physically moving through the system. Enron was no longer judged primarily by how much gas it transported or how much generating capacity it owned. Its value became increasingly tied to predictions about the future. It was a subtle shift, but a dangerous one. Once expectations begin to be treated as assets, the line between what exists and what might exist starts to blur. Outside the company, very few people seemed concerned. The media continued to celebrate Enron as a symbol of innovation. Analysts continued recommending the stock. The share price continued its climb. Inside the company, thousands of employees invested their savings and retirement funds in Enron stock. They believed they worked for one of the finest companies in America. They believed the future was being built right in front of them. What few people realized was that the machine was becoming increasingly dependent on market confidence rather than energy itself. The company appeared wealthier than ever, yet it was becoming more dependent on things that had not happened yet. A gas pipeline can be measured. A power plant can be seen. A future contract cannot. Enron had discovered a way to turn the future into an asset. Soon, the company wanted to take the idea one step further. Not just turning the future into an asset, turning the future into profit. But confidence cannot appear on a balance sheet simply because someone makes a promise. At least, that used to be true. Then Enron found a tool that allowed tomorrow's profits to appear in today's reports. The name of that tool was mark-to-market accounting. In January 1992, a technical decision was approved. On paper, it was simply permission for Enron to apply mark-to-market accounting to certain long-term energy trading contracts. There were no major headlines, no public outcry. To most people, it looked like nothing more than a change in how business results were recorded. Years later, when people looked back at the collapse of Enron, that moment stood out as a quiet turning point with enormous consequences. Not because it was fraud, at least not at the beginning. The method itself was perfectly legal under certain circumstances. The real issue was that it opened a new door, one through which the future could be brought into the present before it had actually arrived. In the traditional business world, profits usually come last. A company signs a contract, produces goods or delivers services, provides the product to the customer, receives payment, and only then records the profit earned. The process may seem slow. It may even make short-term results look less impressive. Yet it offers one crucial advantage. The numbers on the financial statements remain tied to real cash flows. If a project fails, the company records a loss. If a customer does not pay, the reports must be adjusted. The system is far from perfect, but for decades it helped investors distinguish between money that already existed and promises about the future. Enron did not want to wait that long. At its Houston headquarters, where energy trading screens glowed around the clock, mark-to-market was viewed as a modern breakthrough. The basic idea was surprisingly simple. Imagine Enron signed a 10-year energy contract. The company estimated that the agreement would generate roughly $1 billion in revenue. The expected cost of fulfilling the contract was about $800 million. The projected profit was $200 million. Under traditional accounting, that profit would be recognized gradually over the 10 years of the contract. Each year, a small portion would appear in the financial statements, reflecting work completed and money actually earned. Mark-to-market worked differently. The moment the contract was signed, the company could estimate the future value of the entire agreement. A substantial portion of the expected profit could be recorded almost immediately. The cash had not arrived. The work had not been completed. Many risks still lay ahead, yet the profit was already showing up on the books. That was what made the method so attractive. Growth appeared faster. Financial statements looked stronger. Analysts on Wall Street saw impressive numbers. The stock price responded positively. A contract signed today could instantly create the appearance of prosperity. In the early years, the risks remained manageable. Long-term energy contracts were relatively stable. Forecasting revenue and costs was not perfect, but it was grounded in a reasonable amount of data and experience. The strongest advocate for this approach was Jeffrey Skilling. He did not view mark-to-market merely as an accounting tool. He saw it as a way of reflecting the true value of a modern marketplace. Skilling believed markets were capable of evaluating the future efficiently. If the value of a contract over the next 10 years could be estimated using financial models, why wait 10 years to recognize it? If the market could already see that value, then the company should be able to use it today. The argument sounded reasonable. To many investors at the time, it even sounded progressive. But a problem was beginning to emerge. A forecast is not the same thing as the truth. A forecast is simply humanity's best attempt to imagine what has not happened yet. It may be right. It may also be wrong. Once those forecasts are placed inside financial statements, the distance between assumption and reality begins to shrink in dangerous ways. Accounting starts to rely less on what has actually happened and more on what people believe will happen. The problem did not appear immediately. It surfaced only when Enron began expanding into businesses that were increasingly difficult to value. Between the middle of the 1990s and the end of the century, Enron was no longer an ordinary energy company. It moved into international markets, invested in telecommunications, entered the internet bandwidth business, pursued technology ventures, and launched a long list of untested business models. Every new venture brought greater uncertainty. In traditional energy markets, future cash flows could still be estimated using historical data and relatively stable demand patterns. In these newer businesses, the future became far more difficult to see. No one truly knew how much revenue some of these projects would generate years down the road. No one could predict with confidence how customers would respond, yet forecasts still had to be made. What made the situation particularly significant was that the people creating those assumptions were Enron itself. The company gained increasing power to decide what the future would look like on paper. A few changes in assumptions about revenue, growth rates, or market demand could alter the value of a project by hundreds of millions of dollars. Everything worked fine if the forecasts eventually became reality. But what happened if they did not? A successful project caused no problems. The system continued to operate as expected. But when a project underperformed, when customers failed to appear as anticipated, or when revenues came in below forecasts, a paradox began to emerge. The profits from that project may have already been recorded years earlier. To correct the reports, Enron would have to admit that its original assumptions were wrong. The company would have to reduce profits. It would have to accept the negative consequences that such revisions could have on its stock price. That was an extremely difficult choice in an environment where Wall Street demanded constant growth. Every quarter had to outperform the previous one. Every year had to exceed the last. The stock price had to keep rising. Under those conditions, every adjustment that brought the company closer to reality became more expensive. Gradually, two different versions of Enron began to exist at the same time. The first version appeared in the financial statements. It was a company delivering powerful growth, steadily improving profits, relentless innovation, and constant forward momentum. The second version existed in the real world. Some investments were performing below expectations. Some objectives were not being achieved. Some cash flows were failing to materialize as planned. The distance between those two versions did not explode overnight. It widened slowly, a little more each quarter. Not enough to trigger panic, not enough to make investors immediately suspicious, but enough to force the company to keep defending the numbers it had already reported. In Houston, the psychological consequences began to emerge. Outside Enron's headquarters, investors looked at the financial statements and saw billions of dollars in profits. They saw a bright future. They saw the model for a new economy. Inside the company, many engineers and project managers were confronting very different realities. They saw operational problems. They saw projects failing to perform as planned. They saw growing gaps between goals and outcomes. It became increasingly difficult for internal warnings to compete with attractive numbers on financial statements. That was the most important turning point of this period. Truth was no longer measured primarily by actual results. It began to be measured by expectations about the future. Mark-to-market did not destroy Enron overnight. It did not create a bankruptcy in a single moment. What it created was an environment in which predictions could be treated as facts. An environment in which optimistic assumptions were rewarded more generously than cautious warnings. Once an organization begins living in the future instead of the present, mistakes no longer arrive in their familiar form. They do not always look like failure. They can look like growth. They can look like success. They can even look like profit. But every prediction carries a weakness that can never be eliminated. It can be wrong. By the end of the 1990s, more and more of Enron's projects were failing to deliver what had been promised. Profits that had once been recorded on paper were gradually losing their foundation in the real world. And in the widening space between expectation and reality, numbers that had never truly existed began to appear. From 1997 through early 2001, Enron appeared to be living through the most glorious chapter in its history. Its stock price kept climbing to new highs. Analysts on Wall Street held it up as the model of a modern company, agile, innovative, and ahead of its time. Enron's name regularly appeared on prestigious rankings. Its leadership team was celebrated as a group of visionaries who could see the future before anyone else. The picture was so impressive that very few people wanted to look closely at the shadows forming underneath it. Some major projects were not developing the way they had been promised. Certain profits had been recognized years earlier based on long-term forecasts. Meanwhile, the cash those profits were supposed to generate was not arriving at the expected pace. Earnings continued to be reported. Real money showed up much more slowly, and in some cases barely showed up at all. A bad forecast alone is not enough to destroy a large corporation. It happens every day in business. The problem begins when multiple bad forecasts are transformed into profits on financial statements. At that point, a company faces a difficult choice. It can admit that its original assumptions were too optimistic, or it can create new stories to protect the old ones. Enron increasingly leaned toward the second option. The first clear warning signs emerged from a project that had once been presented as a symbol of the company's global ambitions. In Dabhol, in the Indian state of Maharashtra, Enron placed a massive bet on a future it believed was certain to arrive. Under the leadership of Rebecca Mark, head of Enron International, the company no longer wanted to be seen as simply an American energy business. The larger goal was to become a global infrastructure powerhouse. The Dabhol Power Project was meant to prove that vision. It was one of the largest international investments Enron had ever undertaken. Billions of dollars flowed into construction, contracts, and a business model promoted as the future of electricity generation in developing economies. On paper, everything looked convincing. The plant was built, agreements were signed. Revenue and profit projections created the impression that this would be a spectacular success. But the real world does not operate on spreadsheets. Electricity from the project was significantly more expensive than many local customers could afford. The Maharashtra government began challenging key terms of the agreements. Political disputes emerged. Legal battles stretched on for years. Actual demand fell well short of the optimistic assumptions built into the original financial models. Dabhol had been described as a victory for globalization, yet the cash flow generated by the project failed to match what had been promised. Success on paper and results in the real world began drifting farther and farther apart. If Dabhol revealed the limits of global ambition, the next project exposed the limits of predicting the future. In 1999 and 2000, the internet boom swept across America. Young technology companies were being valued at billions of dollars, based largely on promises about what they might become. Investors cared less about current profits. What mattered was projected growth in the years ahead. Jeffrey Skilling did not want Enron left behind. In Houston, the company launched Enron Broadband Services. The idea sounded compelling. If electricity and natural gas could be traded like commodities, why not internet bandwidth in Enron's vision? Bandwidth would become an asset that could be bought, sold, speculated on, and traded at scale. The company believed it was standing at the edge of an entirely new market. In theory, it was revolutionary. But once again, reality refused to follow the theory. The market Enron expected to explode never developed at the projected pace. Customers did not arrive quickly enough. Trading volume never reached the necessary scale. The business model failed to generate the cash flow that had been built into its expectations. What mattered was not that the project struggled. Many companies have failed while pursuing new ideas. What mattered was that the numbers on the outside continued to look beautiful. Throughout the late 1990s and the opening months of 2001, Enron continued reporting impressive growth. Its financial statements still conveyed the image of a company operating at full strength. The stock price continued to enjoy the market's confidence. Inside the system, reality was becoming increasingly complicated. Many projects were underperforming. Some investments were not producing meaningful cash. A significant portion of reported profits existed only through long-term forecasting models. Cash is the hardest thing to fake in the corporate world. A company can explain away many kinds of expenses. A company can change how it recognizes revenue. But real money either arrives or it does not. That was the signal many investors overlooked. In the optimism of the era, accounting profits attracted far more attention than actual cash flow. The gap between the two kept growing. Eventually, Enron faced the question every organization fears. What happens if the forecasts everyone treated as certain turn out to be wrong? If the numbers were adjusted, the stock price could collapse. A reputation built over years could be damaged. Wall Street's confidence could disappear. If the numbers were not adjusted, the company would have to keep defending what it had already reported. That was the true breaking point of the story. Enron gradually shifted from managing a business to managing market perception. What mattered was no longer the results unfolding in the real world. What mattered was what the market believed about those results. The change quietly spread through the company's Houston headquarters as well. Some employees began noticing unusual patterns. In many meetings, the stock price was discussed more often than customers. Growth received more attention than cash flow. Future projections carried more weight than results that had actually been achieved. It was a strange paradox. Enron was an energy company. Yet energy itself was no longer the central topic in many of its most important discussions. The thing being defended most aggressively had become the stock price. Little by little, the stock price began replacing the actual product. By the end of 2000, new pressures continued to build. Underperforming investments accumulated. Debt increased. Some assets lost value. Cash flow came under growing strain. Every quarter brought fresh demands for continued growth in order to meet expectations created in earlier quarters. Mark-to-market accounting could help recognize profits expected from the future, but it couldn't make weakening assets disappear. It couldn't erase the losses gradually becoming visible beneath the glossy surface. Enron needed a new solution. The numbers that did not exist did not appear overnight. They were built from countless assumptions, hundreds of forecasts, and a system that had become increasingly afraid of admitting it was wrong. By this point, the challenge was no longer simply making money. The larger challenge was finding a way to keep the story believable, to hide a loss. You need a place to put it where nobody can see it. To hide billions of dollars, you need something far more complicated. The man preparing to build that structure was Andrew Fastow. By early 2000, Enron had moved beyond the stage where overly optimistic promises could still explain away every problem. Many projects once promoted as the future of the energy industry were failing to deliver the expected results. Some investments were beginning to lose value. Actual cash flow was not growing at the same pace as the profits being reported. The gap between the story Enron told the market and the financial reality inside the company was becoming wider by the day. The biggest problem was not whether Enron had debt. It did. The impaired assets still existed. The failed investments were still buried somewhere within the system. What was remarkable was that most investors could not see them. On paper, Enron still appeared to be a company enjoying extraordinary growth. Its stock price kept climbing. Its financial statements continued to project the image of a profit machine that never seemed to slow down. That led to a simple but unsettling question. How could a company make billions of dollars in debt almost disappear from the market's view? The answer centered on a man who spent far less time in the spotlight than Kenneth Lay or Jeffrey Skilling. His name was Andrew Fastow. If Skilling designed Enron's vision of growth, Fastow was entrusted with managing the consequences that growth left behind. The machine had been pushed too hard. Strange noises were beginning to come from inside it. Fastow's job was not to repair the machine. His job was to make sure the people standing outside never heard those sounds. Born in 1961, Fastow graduated from Tufts University and spent years working in banking and corporate finance before joining Enron. In 1998, he became the company's chief financial officer. Officially, his responsibilities included raising capital, managing debt, and building financial structures to support business operations. In practice, his role gradually expanded into something much larger. He became the architect of a parallel financial world existing alongside Enron itself. He was not the executive giving inspiring speeches to investors. He was not the public face delivering grand visions of the new economy. Most of Fastow's work took place inside spreadsheets, lengthy contracts, and legal entities that most shareholders had never even heard of. It was in those places that the true foundations of the coming crisis were being built. Years later, during investigations, Fastow admitted that many of the financial structures had been created to achieve the reporting outcomes Enron wanted. It was a short statement, but it captured the essence of the problem. The goal was no longer to reflect reality. The goal was to create a desired version of reality. Fastow's most powerful tool was not sophisticated software or some secret mathematical model. It was a network of companies that existed largely on paper. Their technical name was Special Purpose Entities, commonly known as SPEs. In principle, SPEs are legal entities created for a specific financial purpose. In normal business environments, they are entirely legitimate tools. Companies used them to finance projects, manage risk, or raise capital for separate operations. The SPE itself was not the problem. The problem was how Enron used it. Rather than treating SPEs as business tools, Fasto turned them into storage facilities for things Enron did not want investors to see. Debt could be moved off the balance sheet. Declining assets could be transferred elsewhere. Risks that should have appeared in financial reports were placed inside boxes sitting beyond the market's field of vision. The result was a strange contrast. Investors saw a company carrying less debt than it actually had. Financial statements appeared healthier than reality. Yet the economic obligations tied to those debts had not disappeared at all. They had merely been moved from one location to another. The first major test of this system appeared in 1997 with a name that is less remembered today than some of the entities that followed. It was called Chuco. At the time, Enron and a large pension fund jointly owned a partnership known as Jedi. When the partner wanted to exit the arrangement, Enron faced a difficult choice. If it bought the ownership stake directly, a substantial amount of debt would have appeared on the company's financial statements. Fasto proposed another solution. A new SPE was created under the name Chuco Investments. On paper, this entity purchased the ownership stake the partner wanted to sell. As a result, the related debt no longer appeared to belong to Enron. To outside investors, the financial picture barely changed, but economically, the risk remained closely tied to Enron. The company would still suffer if things went wrong. The debt had not truly disappeared. It had only disappeared from the place where the public was looking. It was the first experiment, and it worked better than anyone expected. The apparent success of Chuco created a new confidence within Enron. If one SPE could help conceal hundreds of millions of dollars in financial obligations, multiple SPEs could help conceal much larger numbers. Out of that thinking came two new entities between 1999 and 2000. Their names were LJM1 and LJM2. This is where the story moved beyond financial complexity and into something far more serious. A conflict of interest. Andrew Fasto remained Enron's chief financial officer. At the same time, he was allowed to participate in managing the LJM partnerships. The arrangement created an extraordinarily dangerous situation. On one side stood Enron. On the other stood entities conducting transactions with Enron. The same individual held influence over both. In many cases, Fasto was effectively negotiating with himself. He helped design the transactions. He helped approve the transactions. He also stood in a position to benefit from the outcomes of those transactions. The boundaries meant to protect shareholders began to blur. Years later, the arrangement would be viewed as one of the most severe examples of corporate conflict of interest in American business history. Not only because of the scale of the transactions, but because governance systems allowed the situation to continue for so long. Yet the primary purpose of LJM was not simply buying and selling assets. Its true purpose was to help Enron postpone recognizing losses that were steadily growing larger. When an investment declined in value, when a project failed to meet expectations, or when an asset was no longer worth what earlier projections claimed, a normal company would record the loss. Enron chose a different path. The asset would be transferred into an SPE. On the financial statements, the loss would disappear or shrink dramatically. Profits would be preserved. The image of growth would remain intact. But in the real world, the loss was still there. No value had been restored. No new cash had appeared. The loss had simply changed addresses. It was like moving an object from one room to another in the same house, and then declaring that the object no longer existed. Investors saw profits. The internal system quietly absorbed losses. The most dangerous part had not yet emerged. Many of the SPEs in this network were not truly independent, despite appearances. A significant portion of their value was backed by Enron's own stock. That was the fatal weakness hidden inside the structure. As long as the stock price rose, the SPEs appeared stable. As long as the SPEs appeared stable, losses could remain hidden. As long as the losses remained hidden, market confidence stayed intact. And that confidence helped push the stock price even higher. A closed loop had formed. The system survived because of the stock price. The stock price survived because of the system. This was no longer a conventional financial foundation. It had become a self-reinforcing mechanism. Every new cycle made the structure larger, but also more fragile. By 2000, many investors still believed Enron was one of the strongest companies in America. The company continued to be praised as a model of innovation. Major financial institutions maintained positive recommendations. The stock traded near the highest levels in its history. Beneath that surface, however, a significant portion of Enron's financial structure depended on one dangerous assumption: that the stock price would never experience a serious decline. It was an extraordinarily risky belief, because the moment confidence changed, the entire system would be forced to confront everything it had spent years trying to hide. This was the point at which Enron crossed the most important line in its history. Before, the company had mostly been guilty of being too optimistic about the future. Now, it had begun actively constructing systems designed to conceal the present. Profits were no longer being used to support the stock price. The stock price was gradually becoming a tool for creating profits on paper. The image had begun feeding the reality. Once that happens, all it takes is one sufficiently precise question asked at exactly the right moment to shake the entire structure to its foundation. The remaining question was how all of this managed to survive for so many years. Thousands of transactions had taken place. Billions of dollars had been moved. Hundreds of financial reports had been issued. Some people saw the warning signs. The remarkable thing is that they kept signing their names anyway. Some frauds happen because no one realizes what is taking place. Others are discovered only after it is far too late. The people responsible for oversight eventually see the problem, but only after the damage has already been done. Enron raised a far more disturbing possibility. What if the people being paid to detect risk had seen the warning signs long before the collapse? What if the important questions had already been asked years before the company fell apart? What if the suspicious transactions had never been perfectly hidden at all, but had been sitting in plain sight of the very people tasked with examining them? That is why the Enron story is not just the story of an energy company. It is also the story of the failure of one of the most trusted oversight systems in the American economy. A company can mislead investors for a while. A talented management team can craft compelling stories that persuade the market. But to maintain an illusion for years, to keep millions of people believing despite increasingly obvious warning signs, something else is required. It requires validation. In Enron's case, that validation came from Arthur Andersen. Between 1997 and 2001, Arthur Andersen's Houston office sat at the center of a relationship that would have far-reaching consequences for the entire American financial system. At the time, the global auditing industry was dominated by the world's largest firms. Among them, Arthur Andersen held a unique position. Long before Enron existed, the firm had built its reputation on professional independence and integrity. For investors, an Arthur Andersen signature was not simply an administrative formality. It was viewed as assurance that the numbers had been carefully examined. If a financial statement carried Andersen's approval, much of the market automatically assumed the information inside could be trusted. Looking back on Enron's collapse, the most important question is no longer what the company did to create unattractive financial reports. The larger question is what the auditors saw throughout the process. At the center of that relationship stood David Duncan, the audit partner directly responsible for the Enron account. His role included reviewing financial statements, evaluating major transactions, and ultimately issuing audit opinions on reports released to the public. Over time, the relationship between the audit team and Enron's leadership became increasingly close. The two sides worked together continuously on major projects. Their discussions extended beyond reviewing data and often involved how complex transactions would be presented to investors and the public. In any oversight system, the distance between the examiner and the examined matters greatly. That distance creates independence. As it gradually disappears, the ability to make objective judgments begins to fade as well. Yet familiarity was only part of the problem. The more significant issue was revenue. By the end of the 1990s, Enron had become one of Arthur Andersen's most profitable clients. The firm was not limited to traditional auditing services. It also provided a wide range of consulting work, including accounting advice, management system support, and assistance in structuring transactions. That was where the conflict of interest emerged. Investors believed auditors were hired to independently evaluate the numbers. In reality, the same organization was receiving substantial fees from helping the very client it was supposed to oversee. The more services that were sold, the more revenue was generated. The more dependent the firm became on that revenue, the harder it became to challenge the client. A relationship originally built on professional skepticism slowly gave way to the desire to preserve a valuable business partnership. That was the moment when truth began competing with profit. Against this backdrop, a little-known figure entered the story. Carl Bass was a senior accounting specialist within Arthur Andersen. Between 1999 and 2001, he began taking a closer look at the SPE structures Enron was using. What he found troubled him. Many transactions appeared to produce accounting effects far larger than their actual economic value. Some structures generated no meaningful new cash flow, while dramatically improving the company's financial appearance. Others seemed to lack a clear business purpose and appeared designed primarily to achieve desired reporting outcomes. Bass did not immediately accuse anyone of fraud. He did what a trained audit professional is supposed to do. He asked questions. He requested explanations. He recommended further review. He pushed for deeper examination of the growing network of special entities appearing throughout Enron's financial ecosystem. In a healthy system, warnings like these are treated as signals that deserve additional investigation. The person raising concerns is supported and encouraged to dig deeper. That is not what happened. Enron's leadership became increasingly frustrated by bosses' questions. Transactions the company wanted completed were delayed. The scrutiny created obstacles for plans that management wanted to move forward quickly. Bass did not become a problem because he had proven wrongdoing. He became a problem because he slowed the machine down. What happened next became one of the most symbolic moments in the entire Enron story. Instead of expanding the investigation, Arthur Andersen removed Carl Bass from the Enron engagement team. The person asking questions had to leave. The controversial transactions remained. That moment revealed a troubling reality. The system did not fail because it could not see the problem. The system failed because of how it responded once it saw the problem. From that point forward, the mutual dependency between Enron and Arthur Andersen became increasingly clear. Andersen understood that Enron was a strategic client. Enron understood that Andersen needed to keep that client. A cycle of shared interests took shape. The result was predictable. The SPE structures remained in place. The controversial transactions continued to receive approval. Financial statements continued to receive audit opinions. Investors continued to believe. On paper, the control system remained fully intact. Procedures were followed, meetings were held, reports were reviewed and signed. In reality, part of the system had shifted from oversight to preservation. Within internal discussions, there were people who recognized that the transactions were becoming unusually complex. There were people who understood that the gap between reported profits and actual cash flow was widening. There were people who sensed that the explanations were becoming increasingly difficult to defend. The tragedy is that the system did not reward those who kept asking questions. It rewarded those who helped keep everything running smoothly. Sometimes stability is valuable. Sometimes stability is simply another word for silence. A large-scale lie rarely survives because of one individual alone. It survives because many people choose not to look too closely at things they have already begun to doubt. Enron had people who created complex financial structures. It had executives willing to push the system to its limits. But that illusion would have been far harder to sustain for so long without an institution willing to give it the appearance of legitimacy. When the gatekeeper becomes more concerned about losing a client than losing the truth, the gate is no longer being guarded. Collective silence does not appear on its own. It needs the right environment to grow. A place where asking questions is treated as an obstacle to progress. A place where honesty brings little reward. A place where fear quietly shapes everyday decisions. Enron built exactly that kind of environment. And this was only the beginning of an even larger problem waiting just ahead. After Enron collapsed, one of the most common questions raised during investigations, congressional hearings, and lengthy interviews with former employees seemed remarkably simple. How could a company with more than 20,000 employees hide a disaster of that magnitude? How could thousands of people working every day in offices, trading floors, accounting departments, finance teams, and management divisions failed to see what was happening? Years later, that question appears to contain an assumption of its own. It assumes that nobody saw the problem. The reality was far more complicated. Many people noticed the warning signs. They saw projects that failed to generate the cash flow that had been promised. They saw numbers that looked too good to be true. they saw transactions that became increasingly difficult to explain. What they did not know was not what was happening. What they did not know was whether they should speak up. Major frauds throughout history are rarely protected by perfect secrecy. Too many people are usually involved for everything to remain completely hidden. What protects them is often fear. Fear of isolation, fear of losing a job, fear of being labeled the wrong fit. At Enron, fear did not exist at the edges of the organization. It was built into the way the organization functioned every day. From the late 1990s through 2001, Jeffrey Skilling became one of the strongest advocates for a performance evaluation system known as the Performance Review Committee. Inside the company, employees knew it by a much simpler name, rank and yank. Each year, employees were evaluated and ranked according to performance. Those who fell into the bottom tier were removed. Later investigations frequently cited estimates that roughly 10 to 15% of employees were forced out during each review cycle. What made the system especially notable was that it remained in place even while the company was expanding. Revenues were growing, and many departments were meeting their targets. A system like that sends a very clear message. Not everyone can be safe. Not everyone can stay. To survive, each individual must prove they are more valuable than someone else. Gradually, survival became the highest priority. Cooperation began to carry risks. Sharing opportunities could help someone else move ahead. Colleagues were no longer simply teammates. They were also competitors in the same race. When your career depends on outperforming the person sitting beside you, asking difficult questions is no longer merely an act of courage. It can become an act of self-destruction. Inside Enron's North Tower in Houston, success was rewarded generously. A single profitable deal could turn an employee into a star overnight. A strong quarter could lead to enormous stock-based bonuses. Projects that helped push the share price higher were often celebrated publicly across the company. The opposite side of the equation was just as visible. Failure was remembered. Bad forecasts were remembered. People who slowed progress were remembered. No formal rulebook was required. Employees quickly learned the most important lesson for surviving in that environment. Do not be the bearer of bad news. Do not be the person who lowers expectations. Do not be the person who makes leadership uncomfortable. When thousands of people learn the same lesson, a new culture begins to take shape. It becomes a culture where optimism is rewarded and skepticism often comes at a cost. In most businesses, results are the goal. At Enron, results gradually became proof that someone was right. If the stock price was rising, the strategy must be right. If profits were increasing, the system must be right. If investors continued pouring money into the company, management must be right. A subtle but dangerous shift had taken place. The stock price was no longer simply a reflection of success. It began to function as a measure of virtue. Those who produced growth were viewed as the smartest people in the room. Those who generated profits were assumed to understand more than everyone else. Fewer and fewer people asked uncomfortable questions. Where was that growth actually coming from? How were those profits being created? Where was the real cash flow? Success was no longer a result that needed explanation. Success became the reason to stop questioning. Yet a system becomes truly dangerous only when the people inside it begin to doubt their own judgment. Enron employees looked upward and saw Kenneth Lay, Jeffrey Skilling, and Andrew Fastow. They saw executives appearing on national television. They saw leaders celebrated as some of the brightest minds of their generation. They saw auditors continuing to sign off on the numbers. They saw Wall Street analysts continuing to recommend the stock. They saw the share price continuing to climb. A chain of validation was constantly being reinforced. Each link strengthened every other link. In an environment like that, many employees reached a very natural conclusion. If they noticed something unusual, perhaps they simply did not understand the full picture. Perhaps smarter people had already reviewed it. Perhaps the mistake lay in their own perception rather than in the system itself. That is the most effective form of obedience. No orders are necessary. No threats are required. People begin doubting themselves before they ever doubt the organization. At that point, fear reaches its most perfected form. People censor themselves. A healthy organization needs people who raise alarms. They help identify risks before those risks become disasters. Enron gradually came to see those people as threats to its culture of winning. Those who asked questions were often labeled negative. Those who demanded explanations were viewed as obstacles to progress. Those who questioned complex transactions were seen as people who did not fit the winning mindset the company wanted to promote. Some warnings did emerge. Some experts expressed concerns about the increasingly complex financial structures. Some employees questioned projects that failed to deliver the results that had been promised. Those signals produced little meaningful change. The system did not eliminate mistakes. The system gradually eliminated the people who pointed them out. Years later, during interviews and testimony, many former employees said they never believed they were working for a criminal enterprise. They believed they were working for a company of geniuses, a company operating ahead of the rest of the world, a company so advanced that ordinary rules were no longer enough to explain it. If something appeared unusual, they assumed smarter people understood something they did not. That is how a group can convince itself not to see what is standing directly in front of it. The most dangerous systems are not the ones that force people to lie. They are the ones that persuade people that silence is the most reasonable. Enron built exactly that kind of system. For years, it worked almost perfectly, but no system remains perfect forever. In every organization, there is eventually one person who refuses to participate in the collective silence. At Enron, that person was a senior executive named Sharon Watkins. A letter she wrote during the final days of the empire would become the first sound that exposed the cracks spreading through an entire structure built on trust. August 2001 began with an event that stunned the American financial world. On August 14th, Jeffrey Skilling unexpectedly announced his resignation as Chief Executive Officer. Just months earlier, he had been celebrated as the architect of what many considered the most modern business model in America. The man who had appeared on the covers of business magazines as a management genius suddenly stepped away from the highest position at Enron. The official explanation was brief. It was a personal decision. Outside the company, most of the market accepted that explanation. Analysts continued issuing positive assessments. Many investors still believed Enron was one of the most innovative energy companies in the world. Although the stock was no longer trading at its peak, it was still worth dozens of dollars per share. The financial statements being released continued to portray a company that was growing and headed toward a bright future. From the outside, it was almost impossible to see that one of the largest corporate crises in American history had already begun. Inside Enron's headquarters in Houston, some senior executives were no longer focused on growth targets or the next phase of expansion. Their concerns had changed. They had begun asking a different question. How much longer could the company survive? The person who saw the danger most clearly was not an investigative journalist, not a regulator, not a Wall Street analyst. It was someone working inside the system itself. Sharon Watkins was a vice president at Enron. She joined the company in 1993 and had worked across several key financial divisions. Over nearly a decade, she watched Enron evolve from a traditional energy company into a symbol of the new economy. She understood the company's culture. She understood how transactions were structured. More importantly, she had access to records connected to the network of special purpose entities, commonly known as SPEs. Watkins was not an opponent of the leadership team. She was not seeking media attention. She had no desire to destroy Enron. On the contrary, she believed the company could still be saved if those in power acted soon enough. After Jeffrey Skilling stepped down as CEO, Kenneth Lay returned to active leadership. Watkins decided to bypass several layers of management and contact the company's founder directly. What worried her was not a single deal or an isolated accounting error. What worried her was the entire structure holding Enron together. As she reviewed a series of complex financial transactions, Watkins recognized a frightening reality. Many of the SPEs had been designed in ways that depended directly on Enron's stock price. The company's actual losses had not disappeared. They had simply been moved off the balance sheet through sophisticated legal structures. On paper, Enron still looked healthy. In reality, much of that stability depended on one thing: the stock price had to keep rising. Some of these arrangements only worked as long as the market maintained absolute confidence in the company. If the stock declined significantly, the SPEs would lose their ability to perform their intended function. Once those entities collapsed, the debts and losses that had been hidden away would come rushing back onto Enron's balance sheet. The entire system resembled a bridge being held together by cables stretched tighter and tighter each day. Its foundation rested on a single assumption: the stock price would never fall too far. But no stock rises forever. Watkins understood that this was no longer a debate about accounting techniques. It was a threat capable of bringing down the entire company. On August 15, 2001, just one day after Skilling's resignation, she sent an internal memorandum to Kenneth Lay. In that memo, Watkins warned that Enron could be facing a serious accounting crisis. Existing transactions could attract regulatory scrutiny. Market confidence could evaporate. The stock price could collapse. One sentence from the memo would later become famous. She feared that the company might implode in a wave of accounting scandals. This was not hallway gossip. It was not market speculation. For the first time in the entire Enron story, a major warning had been put into writing and delivered directly to the most powerful person in the company. The truth had been written down. It was sitting on Kenneth Lay's desk. As Enron's founder and chairman of the board, Lay possessed enough authority to change the company's course. he did not completely ignore the warning. Some internal reviews were initiated. Outside legal experts were brought in to examine certain transactions. Yet the most decisive actions never came. Investors were not fully informed about the scale of the risks. Employees whose savings and retirement funds were tied to Enron stock received no warning that matched the danger. The SPE structures remained in place. The accounting system was not fundamentally changed. The underlying problems were not disclosed to the market. Looking back, it became increasingly clear that Lay knew there were serious issues. What remains controversial is that his response did not match the magnitude of the threat. This was the final moment when Enron still had a choice about its future. One path led toward admitting mistakes, accepting short-term losses, acknowledging reality, and restructuring the company. The other path led toward buying time, hoping the market would not notice, hoping the stock price would stop falling, and hoping the future would somehow solve the problems of the present. The leadership chose the second path. From that moment forward, the countdown began. No longer measured in years, no longer measured in quarters. It was measured week by week. The most tragic part of Sharon Watkins' story was not the content of the letter. The tragedy was the reason she wrote it. She did not write it to become a famous whistleblower. She did not write it to take revenge on anyone. She did not write it to destroy the company. She wrote it because she wanted to save the place where she had spent nearly a decade of her career. She wanted to protect colleagues who had invested their savings and retirement funds in company stock. She wanted to prevent the damage that could be inflicted on investors who still believed in Enron, in organizations that have grown accustomed to living on expectations and stock prices. The truth is rarely welcomed as a solution. More often, it is treated as a threat. Watkins' letter reached the right person at the right time about the right problem. That is what makes this chapter of the story more frightening than any accounting trick or fraudulent transaction. The failure did not happen because information was missing. The failure happened because an entire system had lost the ability to accept the information it most needed to hear. As August 2001 slowly came to an end, Jeffrey Skilling was gone. More questions began circulating through the market. The stock price became increasingly volatile. Observers started looking at Enron with caution rather than unquestioning admiration. The empire still appeared standing on the surface. The cracks beneath its foundation had already begun to spread. On August 14, 2001, a brief announcement came out of Enron's headquarters in Houston. On the surface, it appeared to be nothing more than a senior leadership change. Jeffrey Skilling, Enron's chief executive officer, announced his resignation less than 6 months after taking the most powerful position in the company. The news was surprising, not because CEOs rarely step down. What shocked people was who was leaving. For years, Skilling had been regarded as the strategic brain behind Enron. He was one of the key figures responsible for transforming a traditional pipeline company into a massive energy trading powerhouse. He championed new business models, pushed controversial accounting methods, and defended financial structures that very few outsiders fully understood. In the media, he projected an almost unshakable confidence. Whenever questions were raised about Enron's operations, Skilling was often the person who responded most aggressively. For years, he spoke endlessly about the future, a future that according to Enron's story, seemed to contain nothing but growth, innovation, and success. Then suddenly, he was gone. There was no lengthy transition plan, no months of preparation, no warning signs visible to the public. This was not simply a CEO resigning. It was the moment the person who understood the machine better than anyone else stepped away from the controls. The announcement in Houston quickly captured the attention of Wall Street. Kenneth Lay, Enron's founder and the man who had handed leadership to Skilling only months earlier, announced that he would return to run the company. The official explanation was remarkably brief. Personal reasons. That answer should have ended the discussion. Instead, it created even more questions. There was no report of a serious illness. No personal scandal surfaced. No major event was disclosed that could explain such a sudden decision. A man who had just been given the highest authority at one of America's most celebrated corporations abruptly walked away after only a few months. It did not fit the story Enron had been telling for years. Only months earlier, Skilling had appeared on television with his trademark confidence. He continued defending the company's strategy. He continued insisting that Enron was in the strongest position in its history. He continued attacking analysts who dared question the company's financial numbers. The contradiction became too obvious to ignore. If the future was truly as bright as he claimed, why was the person who believed in that future the most choosing to leave? No one had a clear answer. That uncertainty created the first crack in the market's confidence. Inside Enron, the reaction unfolded more quietly. After the resignation announcement, private conversations began appearing more frequently throughout the office. Questions that had once been dismissed as negative or disloyal were now being raised behind closed doors. Many mid-level managers did not have access to the company's complete financial picture. They could only see fragments of it. Yet those fragments were beginning to create a sense of unease. The special entities created to manage debt and assets had become increasingly complex. Many transactions depended directly on Enron's stock price. Reported profits continued appearing on paper, but actual cash flow was not growing at the same pace. Several international projects faced persistent difficulties. Enron Broadband, once promoted as the company's next great engine of growth, was failing to deliver the results that had been promised. No one understood the entire system, but more and more people shared the same thought. The person who designed the system had just walked away from it. At the same time, another reality began attracting attention. While thousands of employees continued holding Enron stock inside their retirement accounts, many senior executives had sold substantial amounts of their own shares in the years leading up to the crisis. Jeffrey Skilling had sold hundreds of thousands of shares. Kenneth Lay had also completed several stock sales worth enormous sums as the market began showing signs of weakness. Most of these transactions were entirely legal. That is precisely what made the story more complicated. There was no clear evidence that selling stock automatically implied guilt. Corporate executives regularly sell shares for personal financial reasons. Yet when those sales were viewed alongside Skilling's sudden resignation, they began taking on a different meaning in the eyes of the public. A quiet question emerged. If Enron was truly safe, why were the people who understood the company best reducing their financial exposure to it? At that point, the market could not yet see the full truth, but it was beginning to sense its presence. The following weeks revealed the existence of two completely different versions of Enron. On the outside, Kenneth Lay continued appearing before investors and analysts. He insisted the company remained exceptionally strong. He declared that he had never been more optimistic about Enron's future. Those statements helped preserve the familiar image the market had trusted for years. Inside the company, a different reality was taking shape. Sharon Watkins had just submitted a memo warning of serious financial problems. Some finance employees were becoming increasingly concerned about the structure of the special entities. Hidden liabilities were growing harder to track. The connections between assets, debt, and stock price were becoming increasingly tangled. The distance between those two worlds continued to widen. One was the Enron of media appearances, speeches, and investor conference calls. The other was the Enron of internal spreadsheets, private meetings, and employees who were beginning to recognize weaknesses in the system. When the gap between image and reality becomes large enough, collapse no longer begins with numbers. It begins with the loss of trust. Years later, some Enron employees would remember Skilling's resignation as the first moment they genuinely felt uneasy. At the time, they did not know the scale of the hidden liabilities. They did not understand the full SPE structure. They could not imagine how quickly the company was approaching the edge. What frightened them was not information. What frightened them was the absence of information. For the first time, they realized that the people leading the company might know something they did not. When confidence in the guides begins to weaken, the entire system starts to shake with it. August 14th, 2001 was not the day Enron collapsed. There was no bankruptcy filing, no handcuffs, no crowds panicking outside the company's headquarters. There was only a resignation letter. Yet corporate history often moves in strange ways. Many empires do not collapse on the day the truth is revealed. They begin collapsing on the day people stop believing the story they have been told for too long. On that day, belief began to crack. Only a small crack, but enough to make everything built above it suddenly fragile. After August 2001, questions became more frequent. Analysts began digging deeper into reports that had previously been accepted with little skepticism. Regulators started paying closer attention. The stock price began showing signs of weakness. The most painful part was still ahead. Because when Enron finally collapsed, the people who suffered the greatest losses were not the executives who left with enormous fortunes, not the banks that could spread their risks, not the investment funds with hundreds of different bets in their portfolios. They were ordinary employees who believed in their company until the very end. And they would be the ones forced to pay the highest price for the cracks that first appeared on that summer day in 2001. October and November of 2001 marked the moment when Enron was no longer battling doubts behind closed doors. The crisis was now unfolding in full view of the market. Months earlier, the sudden departure of Jeffrey Skilling had raised uncomfortable questions. Internal warnings had begun to surface. Analysts kept demanding explanations for financial structures so complex that very few people truly understood them. Even so, much of America still wanted to believe that Enron was simply going through a temporary rough patch. Enron had spent more than a decade building its image as the most innovative company in America. It had become a symbol of innovation, growth, and the ability to turn bold ideas into billions of dollars in profit. The market needed only a few minutes to begin wondering whether that entire story had ever been real. This was no longer a corporate governance crisis. This was the moment when the truth began stepping out of private boardrooms and into public view. The first blow came on October 16, 2001. In its third quarter earnings report, Enron announced a loss of roughly $618 million. At the same time, the company disclosed a reduction in shareholder equity of approximately $1.2 billion tied to transactions involving special purpose entities created during Andrew Fasto's tenure. The numbers stunned the market. It was the largest quarterly loss in Enron's history at that point. Only months earlier, senior executives had continued insisting that the company's financial foundation remained strong. For years, Enron had projected the image of a business that never stopped growing. Now that same company was admitting that billions of dollars had disappeared from what investors thought they had been seeing all along. The frightening part was not the loss itself. The frightening part was the question the market began asking. If numbers like these could appear so suddenly, how much else had not yet been revealed? For the first time, investors realized the problem was not a failed project or a weak quarter. The problem might be embedded in the very financial structure that had helped turn Enron into an American icon. 3 weeks later, that fear was confirmed. On November 8, 2001, Enron announced that it would restate several years of previous financial statements. The company acknowledged that profits had been overstated and that significant debt obligations had been concealed through a complex network of SPEs. For a publicly traded company, few signals are more serious. A financial restatement is not simply an accounting correction. It is an admission that what investors once read may not have been accurate. What they used to value the company may have been distorted. What they trusted may never have existed in the way they believed. Enron's reputation began collapsing even faster than its stock price. The irony was impossible to ignore. The company once celebrated as America's most innovative business was now rewriting its own past. As trust disappeared, money followed. Large investment funds that had once viewed Enron as a core holding began selling. Fidelity reduced its exposure. Vanguard and numerous mutual funds took similar steps. Some institutional investors chose to walk away entirely. Wall Street analysts changed their views at breathtaking speed. Buy recommendations became holds. Then they became sells. Banks began reassessing Enron's creditworthiness. Institutions that had once been willing to provide enormous amounts of capital now demanded greater assurances. Borrowing costs rose. Access to cash became more difficult. For years, Enron had lived on trust. Trust allowed it to raise capital easily. Trust helped it secure massive contracts. Trust convinced partners to do business with it. Once trust vanished, the entire system began running out of oxygen. Yet the most dangerous blow did not come from Wall Street. It came from the very structures Andrew Fasto had built to conceal the truth. Many of the SPEs were built on a simple but extraordinarily dangerous assumption. Their value depended on Enron's stock price. As long as the stock kept rising, the system continued to function. But when the stock began to fall, everything reversed. The decline in share price weakened the value of the collateral supporting the SPEs. As that collateral deteriorated, the SPEs could no longer hide debt the way they once had. Those obligations flowed back onto Enron's balance sheet. Investors saw more debt and became even more alarmed. The stock dropped further. A self-destructive spiral took shape. The stock fell. Debt appeared. Trust declined. The stock fell again. Each cycle hit harder than the one before. The system that had been designed to conceal the problem had become a machine that magnified it. Even then, for most Americans, these were still just numbers on a screen. The tragedy became truly painful only when those numbers began appearing inside employees' retirement accounts. For years, Enron workers had been encouraged to invest in company stock through the 401k plan. Many placed a large portion of their retirement savings into the very company where they worked. They trusted the company. They trusted the leadership. They trusted the future. Then, in October 2001, another event unfolded. Management of the retirement plan was being transferred from Northern Trust to Hewitt Associates. During the transition period, many employees found themselves temporarily locked out of their accounts. They could not buy. They could not sell. They could not adjust their portfolios. Meanwhile, Enron's stock price was falling day after day. All they could do was watch. That moment transformed a financial scandal into a personal tragedy. Every morning, employees logged into their retirement accounts and watched familiar numbers disappear. $10,000, $20,000, $30,000, then even more. The most painful part was that there had been no war, no earthquake, no natural disaster, no catastrophe powerful enough to sweep away the rewards of a lifetime of work. There was only a company they had trusted for years. Some lost the savings of a lifetime. Some postponed retirement. Some returned to work at an age when they believed they would finally be able to rest. Many families watched financial plans built over decades disappear within a matter of weeks. Enron's stock price fell from tens of dollars per share to only a few dollars. Many retirement accounts lost more than 80% of their value. Some lost almost everything they had accumulated. The people who suffered the most were not professional speculators. They were not hedge funds. They were not traders making bets every day. They were engineers, administrative staff, accountants, people who came to the office every morning and spent years helping build Enron. The tragedy was that they did not lose money because of greed. They lost money because of loyalty. Wall Street lost billions of dollars. Banks lost billions of dollars. Major investment funds lost billions as well. But those losses would eventually be recorded in financial reports, audit files, and balance sheets. The people who lost the most had no line item large enough to capture what they had lost. They were the ones who spent decades helping build the company. They believed they were creating a stable future for their families. Then, day by day, they watched that future disappear from their computer screens. The collapse of an empire always leaves rubble behind. But the deepest pain is not found in office towers, financial statements, or billion-dollar losses. It is found in the lives of the people who once believed those towers would stand forever. During the final months of 2001, America was flooded with staggering numbers. Financial news reports spoke of more than $60 billion in market value wiped away. They spoke of massive debts hidden for years. They spoke of one of the largest corporate collapses in modern history. Those figures were large enough to shock the public, yet they also had an unintended effect. They obscured another truth. Most of the people who suffered the deepest losses had never possessed millions of dollars. They did not make their living through financial deals. They lived on savings built 1 month at a time. They lived on retirement funds accumulated through years of work. They lived on money set aside for their children's college education and on mortgage payments that still stretched years into the future. When Enron collapsed, the numbers on Wall Street began to take on the faces of ordinary people living in neighborhoods around Houston. That was when the real consequences emerged. Not in financial statements, not in boardroom meetings. They appeared inside individual households. On December 2, 2001, Enron officially filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. At the time, it was the largest corporate bankruptcy in American history. Just 1 year earlier, the company had been celebrated as a model of American success. Business magazines praised Enron as a symbol of innovation. Business schools studied its model. Investors viewed it as the company of the future. Now that future vanished in a matter of weeks. More than 20,000 employees faced uncertainty. Thousands lost their jobs. Thousands of families lost their primary source of income. Many woke up each morning confronting a question they never imagined they would face at that stage of life. What comes next? The bitter irony was that the very people who helped create Enron's success ended up paying the highest price for its collapse. Yet losing a job was not the greatest loss. The real pain was sitting inside retirement accounts. For years, Enron encouraged employees to invest in company stock through its 401k retirement plan. Internal meetings, leadership messages, and years of optimism reinforced the belief that Enron stock was a safe investment. Many employees viewed it as the foundation of their retirement. Workers between the ages of 45 and 60 were hit the hardest. Many had spent 15 years, 20 years, or even more than 25 years with the company. They were not speculators. They were engineers, operations staff, administrators, and middle managers. Every year, they set aside part of their income for the future. Some had accumulated $200,000 in retirement savings. Others had built accounts worth $300,000. A few had more than $500,000. This was not money earned overnight. It was the result of decades of work. When Enron stock collapsed from more than $90 a share to only a few cents, most of that value disappeared. Losing money in the market can happen to any investor. Markets carry risk. But losing nearly an entire retirement fund within a few months is something entirely different. Many people did not simply lose money. They lost decades of their lives that had been invested in a promise they believed was secure. Savings were not the only thing that disappeared. For some families, their homes disappeared as well. During the late 1990s, Enron's stock price seemed to rise almost without interruption. Years of success convinced many employees that the trend would continue indefinitely. Some mortgaged their homes to borrow additional money for investing. Some used Enron stock as collateral for loans. Others built their entire financial plans around the assumption that the stock would keep climbing. When Enron collapsed, The value of that collateral evaporated while the debt remained. Many families were forced to sell their homes. Some liquidated assets accumulated over a lifetime. Others filed for personal bankruptcy simply to survive the worst period. What had once been viewed as the foundation of financial security became the weight dragging them into crisis. For many others, the tragedy took an even more painful form. They were people on the verge of retirement. They were between 55 and 65 years old. In their minds, their final working years were almost over. Many planned to retire within 2 or 3 years. Some hoped to move to a new home. Some wanted to spend more time with family. Others dreamed of helping their children and grandchildren through college without financial stress. Every one of those plans depended on savings tied to Enron stock. When the stock collapsed, the plans collapsed with it. Many were forced back into the workforce at an age when they should have been enjoying retirement. Some became retail employees. Some took part-time jobs. Others accepted short-term consulting work to generate additional income. Many found themselves earning far less than they once had. They did not fail because they were lazy. They did not fail because they lacked responsibility. They failed because they trusted the place to which they had devoted most of their lives. While thousands of families struggled to salvage their futures, another image began appearing across newspapers and television screens, fueling public outrage. Many senior executives had sold large amounts of Enron stock before the company completely unraveled. During the same period, employees continued holding their shares. Some could not even sell because of restrictions within retirement programs. The contrast required no commentary. The people who understood the company best were reducing their own risk. The people who knew the least were carrying nearly all of it. That moment marked a shift in how the public viewed Enron. This was no longer seen as merely a business failure. It was increasingly viewed as a moral failure. Even then, money was not what hurt most. The deepest wound was trust. During congressional hearings in 2002, many former employees appeared before lawmakers. What stood out was that they rarely spoke about complex financial structures. They spent little time discussing accounting practices or shell entities. The subject that came up again and again was trust. They trusted the company. They trusted the leadership. They trusted the system. They believed that working hard, remaining loyal, and following the guidance of the company would provide a stable future. One former employee described watching a retirement account collapse as feeling like the future was being taken away right before their eyes. That may have been the most accurate description of the entire tragedy. They did exactly what they were encouraged to do. They believed what they were assured was true. Those very actions turned them into victims. From that moment on, the story no longer belonged only to Enron. It became a story about America itself. Money can be earned again. Jobs can be found again. But something deeper had been damaged: trust in corporations, trust in auditors, trust in markets, and trust that those in positions of power would act honestly toward the people who placed their faith in them. After Enron, millions of Americans began looking at their employers differently. They started asking whether financial statements truly reflected reality, whether the numbers on paper could be trusted, whether corporate leaders were actually telling the truth. By this point, the tragedy was no longer hidden inside spreadsheets. It was no longer buried within financial transactions designed in conference rooms. It was no longer confined to decisions made by executives. It lived in kitchens where husbands and wives sat down to recalculate their futures. It lived in living rooms where retirement plans were crossed out and abandoned. It lived in unpaid loans. It lived in people over 60 who were forced to start over when they should have been resting. A corporate lie may begin with numbers, but in the end, it always ends with people. Even so, while thousands of families had already felt the consequences, the world had not yet witnessed the most symbolic moment of the entire disaster. The moment when one of the most powerful corporations in America would finally fall before the eyes of the world. And that is the story of the next chapter. A company can lose money and still survive. A company can lose customers and find new ones. Even a brand can lose its reputation and spend years rebuilding it. In the business world, those kinds of failures are not unusual, but there is another kind of loss. It begins when the people inside an organization start to believe that the truth can no longer be hidden. At that point, documents stop being records of work. They become threats. By the end of 2001, Enron's problem was no longer simply a collapsing stock price. The damage in the market was already severe, but that was not what kept lawyers, auditors, and executives awake at night. What worried them was that outsiders were beginning to ask questions. After Enron announced hundreds of millions of dollars in losses in mid-October 2001, suspicion spread through the market. When the company later admitted that several years of previous financial statements would need to be restated, suspicion turned into alarm. Regulators began paying close attention to Enron. Financial structures that had once been considered too complicated for the public to understand suddenly became the focus of intense scrutiny. Transactions involving Chuco, LJM1, LJM2, and numerous off-balance sheet entities were placed under a microscope. For years, that system had survived because of its complexity. Layers of intermediary companies sat on top of one another. Transactions were described in dense financial language that few people could easily follow. Debts were shifted from one place to another as though they had simply disappeared. Complexity had once been a shield. Now it was a maze investigators were determined to unravel. Lawyers, financial experts, and investigative teams began gathering records. Contracts were reviewed one by one. Transactions were cross-checked. Every connection between Enron and its outside entities was pulled apart and examined. The distance between the truth and those searching for it was growing smaller. It was at that moment that some people began considering a different solution, not an explanation, not a defense, but a way to erase the trail. In Houston, inside the offices of Arthur Andersen, internal discussions emerged as tensions continued to rise. This was no ordinary firm. It was one of the most influential auditing organizations in America, a company that had built its reputation on rigor and professional independence. David Duncan, the audit partner responsible for Enron, was among those directly connected to the enormous volume of records tied to the client. During October 2001, conversations about document retention policies became increasingly frequent. As regulatory attention intensified, large amounts of Enron-related material were routed into destruction procedures. The shredders began running constantly. Boxes of paper records were removed. Audit notes were discarded. Supporting documents connected to financial reviews disappeared from storage systems. Investigations later revealed that the volume of material destroyed during this period amounted to several tons. The greatest irony lay in the nature of the auditor's job itself. Their role was to create an audit trail. Every note, every draft, every archived document existed to show how a review had been conducted. Yet now, those very traces were becoming the things being erased. Paper was no longer the only place where the truth lived. By the beginning of the 21st century, email had become the central communication tool for major financial transactions. Important discussions did not exist only on paper. They lived in inboxes, on servers, and in drafts that had never even been sent. As paper records disappeared, portions of electronic data vanished as well. Many Enron-related emails were deleted from storage systems. Some audit support files no longer appeared in electronic archives. Notes, drafts, and working documents were removed alongside the paper records. The SPE structures had originally been created to hide debt. Now the documents explaining how those structures worked were being erased from history as well. This was no longer a debate about accounting methods. It was beginning to look like obstruction. Yet the most significant part of the story was not the number of documents that were destroyed. It was the fear behind the decision. At that point, Arthur Andersen was not merely auditing Enron. The firm was trying to protect nearly 90 years of its own reputation. For decades, its name had been associated with professionalism, independence, and standards considered foundational to modern auditing. Its leadership understood that if Enron collapsed because of financial fraud, the next question would come immediately. Where had the auditors been all that time? Investigations, lawsuits, and catastrophic reputational damage were already visible on the horizon. Some believed that removing records might reduce future legal exposure. Instead, the decision produced the opposite effect. At first, Arthur Andersen was questioned because it had audited Enron. Soon afterward, it was being investigated for what it had done to its own records. From that moment forward, this was no longer the story of a collapsing energy company. It was the story of two organizations moving toward the edge together. For weeks, the shredders ran almost without pause. Thick stacks of paper were reduced to strips. Box after box disappeared from the offices. The image became a symbol of Enron's final days. A company can destroy paper. It cannot destroy consequences. Every document torn apart only made the remaining questions larger. Every missing file convinced investigators that there might be something even more important still waiting to be found. When an organization becomes afraid of its own records, the crisis has usually gone too far to be saved. Arthur Andersen believed it was protecting its reputation. In reality, it was writing its own indictment. The shredders did not save Enron. They did not save Arthur Andersen either. When the truth becomes something that must be destroyed, the collapse usually began long before anyone noticed it. By late November 2001, investor confidence was nearly exhausted. Banks were losing patience. Partners that had once stood beside Enron were quietly looking for exits. Only a few days remained before one of the most powerful corporations in America finally fell. Sunday, December 2nd, 2001. America woke up to an ordinary winter morning. Coffee shops opened as usual. Flights took off on schedule. Wall Street prepared for another trading week. Yet somewhere between the business headlines and the dry language of legal filings, an event had just taken place that would change the way an entire generation viewed the corporate world. Enron had filed for bankruptcy. Just 1 year earlier, very few people could have imagined such a scenario. Enron was still listed among the most admired companies in America. Business schools continued to feature the company in their curricula as a model of innovation and bold thinking. On Wall Street, Jeffrey Skilling was celebrated as one of the brightest minds of his era. Kenneth Lay moved comfortably among some of the most influential people in the country. Enron was not simply a company. It was a symbol of the future. Then, in less than a year, that symbol became the largest corporate bankruptcy in American history at the time. What was remarkable was not that Enron eventually failed. Warning signs had been appearing for months. What stunned people was the speed of the collapse. Only a short time earlier, executives were still reassuring the market. Official statements continued to speak of recovery. Promises about the future were still being made. The gap between words and reality had shrunk to a matter of weeks. By late November 2001, Enron's last chance of survival was beginning to disappear. After weeks of decline, the company was nearly unable to access new sources of capital. Banks grew increasingly cautious. Trading partners that had once been eager to do business now demanded additional collateral. Each passing day made the situation worse. On November 9th, 2001, a glimmer of hope appeared when Carnegie announced plans to acquire Enron. The market responded immediately and positively. Many employees breathed a sigh of relief. In their eyes, this could be the final lifeline. If the deal went through, Enron might avoid disaster. The company still had assets. It still had a vast business network. What it needed most was an organization large enough and confident enough to take control. But the hope did not last long. As Carnegie's team gained access to more detailed records, what had once been suspicion slowly turned into fact. The true scale of Enron's debt began to emerge. Financial obligations hidden beyond the balance sheet were far larger than the market had ever been led to believe. The deeper the review went, the harder the risks became to accept. On November 28, 2001, the decisive moment arrived. Carnegie officially walked away. There was no buyer, there was no rescue plan, there was no path back. For years, Enron had been praised for its ability to create complex financial structures that seemed capable of solving any problem. The company always appeared to find another deal, another model, or another strategy to overcome difficulties. This time was different. No structure was large enough to hide reality. No calculation could turn debt into assets. No story was convincing enough to keep the market believing. Once Carnegie left, the outcome was almost inevitable. On December 2nd, 2001, in the United States Bankruptcy Court for the Southern District of New York, Enron filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. Legally, it was a procedure that allowed a company to reorganize under court supervision. Symbolically, it was an admission that the company could no longer continue operating in any normal sense. The bankruptcy filing showed that Enron reported approximately $63 billion in assets. That figure made it the largest corporate bankruptcy in American history at the time. The contrast was almost impossible to believe. Just a year earlier, The market valued Enron at tens of billions of dollars. Just a year earlier, the company had been viewed as a model for the new century. Now the entire empire ended with a stack of documents filed in court. A future that had been sold to investors as inevitable had officially collapsed on legal paperwork. Yet the numbers inside the bankruptcy filing were not the biggest shock. The real shock was the stock. In August 2000, Enron shares traded at more than $90 per share. The company ranked among the most valuable firms in the energy industry. Many investors bought the stock not only because of current profits, but because they believed it represented the future. The year 2001 destroyed that belief piece by piece, after revelations involving the SPE entities, after financial restatements, and after a growing list of unanswered questions. The decline turned into panic. Investment funds sold their positions to protect portfolios. Individual investors rushed to get out before it was too late. Credit providers withdrew their trust. The stock kept falling until it was worth only a few cents. More than 99% of its market value was wiped away. Tens of billions of dollars vanished 1 year earlier. People bought Enron because they were afraid of missing the future. 1 year later, they sold Enron because they were afraid they could not escape the past. On the market, all anyone could see were red numbers. But inside Houston, another tragedy was unfolding. At Enron North Tower, thousands of employees still came to work as they always had. The elevators still ran. Computers still powered on. The lights were still bright. Desks remained exactly where they had always been. Physically, nothing seemed different. Yet the company no longer existed in a financial sense. The professional future of thousands of people suddenly became uncertain. Many did not know whether they would still have jobs the following week. Many had no idea how much remained of their retirement savings. Many did not know what they would tell their families when they returned home. Gradually, cardboard boxes began appearing in the hallways. Employees started clearing their desks. Personal belongings were carried out of the building. Areas once filled with energy and ambition became covered by a heavy silence. The image became the perfect symbol of Enron's collapse. The building was still standing, but trust had already left. Many employees later described December 2nd as an almost unreal experience. They could still see the familiar walls. They could still see their colleagues. They could still see the company logo displayed throughout the offices. Only the future had disappeared. What made this tragedy unique was that Enron had never been merely a business. In the eyes of millions, Enron was a story. It was a story about innovation, a story about intelligence, a story about a generation of executives who believed they could redefine every old rule. The greatest tragedy was that this story had not been built primarily on cash flow or tangible assets. It had been built on trust, the trust of investors, the trust of employees, the trust of customers, the trust of the market. Once that extraordinary asset was exhausted, no bank was large enough to provide another loan. At the end of this journey, Enron still had assets. Enron still had buildings. Enron still had contracts. Enron still had employees. But it no longer possessed the one thing that mattered most: credibility. In the financial world, money can create a business. Money can expand a business. Money can acquire a business. But trust is what keeps a business alive. On December 16, 2001, a corporation officially entered bankruptcy. Yet that was not the end of the story. The documents were still there. The witnesses were still there. The investigations were still moving forward. Across America, one question continued to grow larger amid the ruins of Enron. Who was responsible? An empire can collapse in a single day, but the truth about how it was built often takes years to uncover from the wreckage left behind. From 2002 to 2006, America witnessed a scene that only a few years earlier would have seemed almost unimaginable. Kenneth Lay and Jeffrey Skilling, men who had once appeared on the covers of prestigious business magazines, who had been invited to speak before investors, regulators, and students at elite universities, now walked into federal courtrooms as defendants. For nearly a decade, they had been seen as symbols of a new era, an era in which technology, finance, and innovation were believed capable of rewriting the old rules of the economy. They once stood on stages explaining to America how the future would work. Now they sat before juries explaining their own past. Enron's bankruptcy did not bring the story to an end. It merely opened the next chapter, one that was even larger and more complicated. As the company disappeared from the marketplace, the legal system began trying to answer the question that tens of thousands of employees, investors, and ordinary citizens had been asking since late 2001. Who was responsible? From late 2001 through 2006, one of the largest corporate investigations in American history unfolded. The Department of Justice, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, congressional investigative committees, and numerous federal prosecutors became part of a process that stretched across years. The scale of the effort was enormous. Millions of pages of internal records were collected. Thousands of emails were recovered and analyzed. Hundreds of witnesses were called upon to explain decisions that had been made years earlier. Investigators were no longer focused on whether Enron had simply been a failed business. They wanted to understand how the off-balance sheet entities had been created. Who knew about those transactions when senior executives became aware of the risks involved? Which information had been shared with investors and which information had been withheld? The deeper the investigation went, the more it shifted away from the idea of business failure and toward the suspicion of deliberate fraud. Among the many names that surfaced in the records, prosecutors paid particular attention to three figures: Jeffrey Skilling, Kenneth Lay, and Andrew Fastow. The first to fall was Andrew Fastow. For years, Fastow had been regarded as the financial architect behind Enron's most complex structures. He helped design Juco. He created LJM1 and LJM2. He also stood on both sides of numerous transactions, representing Enron's interests while simultaneously participating in entities that conducted business with Enron itself. As investigators followed the money, the connections became increasingly clear. Millions of dollars in management fees and personal profits were uncovered. Transactions marked by obvious conflicts of interest became difficult to deny. Structures that had once been presented as sophisticated financial tools began to look very different under closer scrutiny. In 2004, Fastow made the most consequential decision of the entire case. He pleaded guilty and agreed to cooperate with prosecutors. It marked a major turning point. For the first time, someone from the center of the system confirmed many of the things that had previously existed only as suspicions. What had once been speculation now came with direct testimony from one of the people who helped build the system. In exchange for that cooperation, Fasto received a substantially lighter sentence than many other executives, but the price was still significant. The man who had constructed Enron's most intricate financial maze had become the guide leading investigators through it. Fasto, however, was not the prosecution's ultimate target. That distinction belonged to Jeffrey Skilling. If Kenneth Lay was the public face of Enron, Skilling was widely regarded as the strategic mind behind the entire empire. He was the strongest defender of mark-to-market accounting. He drove the company's culture of extreme internal competition. He was also one of the executives who repeatedly assured the market that Enron remained strong and healthy. The charges against Skilling included securities fraud, conspiracy to deceive investors, and providing false information to the market. The 2006 trial lasted for months. Prosecutors presented jurors with internal emails, meeting records, and testimony from former employees. Andrew Fasto also appeared as a witness. The prosecution's case wasn't built around proving that Enron had pursued failed projects. Every company experiences failures. The central issue was the gap between what investors were told and what was being discussed inside the company. According to prosecutors, the market was hearing a completely different story from the one senior management understood internally. That gap between the two narratives became the heart of the case. In May 2006, the jury found Skilling guilty on multiple counts. His original sentence was 24 years and 4 months in prison. The image was striking. A man who had once explained the market to all of America had become one of the market's most famous examples of corporate fraud. Yet the name that carried the greatest emotional weight for the public remained Kenneth Lay. Lay was more than a corporate executive. For many employees, he was Enron itself. He had spent decades building the company's reputation and shaping his own image as a trusted leader. In 2006, Lay stood trial alongside Skilling, facing numerous fraud and conspiracy charges. After the proceedings concluded, the jury found him guilty. The verdict was viewed as a major victory for prosecutors. One of the most powerful figures in late 20th century American corporate history had been found criminally responsible. Then, an unexpected event changed everything. In July 2006, before sentencing could take place and before the appeals process had been completed, Kenneth Lay died of a heart attack. Under the legal doctrine applied at the time, his criminal conviction was vacated because he died before the judicial process had fully concluded. For many victims, the feeling was difficult to describe. They heard the verdict, they saw the jury find him guilty, yet they never witnessed the punishment being carried out. The truth had emerged. Justice, however, was left with an empty space. It was not only individuals who paid the price. Another giant collapsed alongside Enron. Arthur Andersen had once been one of the Big Five, the 5 largest accounting firms in the world. With nearly 90 years of history and more than 80,000 employees worldwide, Andersen was considered one of the defining institutions of modern auditing. As the investigation progressed, attention shifted beyond the quality of Andersen's audits. A far more serious issue emerged when large quantities of Enron-related documents were destroyed just as regulators began examining the scandal. prosecutors focused on obstruction of justice. Ultimately, Anderson was convicted for its role in the destruction of records. The impact was almost immediate. Clients left. Trust vanished. Offices around the world gradually dissolved. An organization once considered untouchable rapidly lost the foundation on which it had been built. Anderson's collapse reshaped the entire accounting profession. The Big Five became the Big Four. It was a bitter irony. The firm hired to verify the truth ultimately fell because of the way it handled the evidence. After years of investigations and trials, verdicts had been delivered, defendants had been convicted or had pleaded guilty. Yet for many people, one question still remained. Did any of it truly make things right? Thousands of former employees followed the trials closely. Many had lost their retirement savings. Many lost their homes. Many lost careers they had spent decades building. They understood that most of the money was never coming back. They understood that time could not be reversed. The years that had been taken from them could not be restored by any sentence. What they sought was not simply financial compensation. They wanted an explanation. They wanted acknowledgement. They wanted to know what had happened inside the system they had once trusted completely. Sometimes justice is not about recovering what was lost. Sometimes justice is simply about forcing the truth into the open so that no one can deny it any longer. By this point, the picture was complete. Enron had fallen. Arthur Andersen had fallen. Andrew Fastow had pleaded guilty. Jeffrey Skilling had been convicted. Kenneth Lay had died before formal sentencing could take place. For years, these people and institutions had been regarded as too large to fail. They possessed enough money, power, prestige, and influence to shape the perceptions of an entire market. Yet in the end, no one proved powerful enough to stand outside the consequences of the lies they helped create. When the truth arrives too late, justice can no longer restore what has been lost. The only thing left is to record the names of those who tried to keep the truth from emerging, and to remember that every system built on illusion will eventually face the day it is exposed. After the bankruptcy, after the years of investigations, after the trials that captured the attention of the entire country, the curtain was finally pulled back. Complex financial structures were decoded. Companies that existed only on paper were exposed. Internal emails became public. Testimony entered the public record. At last, America understood what Enron had done. But as the legal questions slowly found their answers, another question began to emerge. It had nothing to do with accounting, nothing to do with corporate law, nothing to do with any clause buried inside a financial statement. If a single person is deceived, it may be naivety. If a small group is deceived, it may be the result of manipulation. But when millions of people believe in something that is not real, the phenomenon moves beyond the boundaries of an ordinary fraud. It becomes something larger. It becomes a social phenomenon. That is also what made Enron different from so many other scandals in business history. The company did not operate in the shadows. It did not hide in secret offices. It did not avoid public attention. Quite the opposite. Enron lived directly under the spotlight. It appeared in the nation's largest newspapers. It was praised by some of the most respected institutions. It was studied by the most prestigious business schools because it was seen everywhere. it became trusted even more. After the shock of Enron, America's political and legal systems reacted quickly. Lawmakers understood that confidence in the financial markets had been seriously damaged. In 2002, sweeping new legislation was passed to change how public companies operated and reported information to investors. For the first time, the personal responsibility of corporate leaders came under far stricter scrutiny. Chief executives and chief financial officers could no longer easily avoid accountability by blaming subordinates or accounting systems. They were required to personally certify the accuracy of financial reports. If they knowingly provided false information, the consequences could include criminal penalties. Auditing practices were tightened as well. Accounting firms could no longer freely perform audits, while simultaneously earning large consulting fees from the same clients. Conflicts of interest that had once been treated as routine suddenly found themselves under a microscope. Requirements for internal controls also changed dramatically. Public companies now had to demonstrate that their financial oversight systems actually worked. It was no longer enough for executives to simply declare that everything was under control. The role of corporate boards expanded as well. Audit committees were expected to be more independent. Financial oversight became a real responsibility rather than a procedural formality. It was one of the most significant corporate governance reforms in modern American history. Yet laws can only repair what has already happened. They can change procedures. They can add regulations. They can increase penalties. But they cannot answer the most important question. Why was Enron able to survive for so long? Part of the answer lies with the more than 20,000 employees who once worked there. Years after Enron collapsed, many outsiders continued asking why employees failed to recognize that something was wrong. The answer is often simpler than people imagine. Every day they walked into one of Houston's most impressive office buildings. Every day they watched the stock price climb higher. Every day they read articles praising the company. They saw colleagues being promoted. They saw bonuses growing larger. They saw hiring expand year after year. Everything around them was sending the same message. The company was succeeding. In that environment, skepticism became the unusual behavior. When everything appears to be moving upward, the person asking difficult questions is often seen as pessimistic or lacking vision. Success creates a powerful form of social proof. It convinces people that if enough others believe something, it must be true. Most employees did not believe in Enron because of greed. They believed because everything they saw each day looked real. The offices were real. The bonuses were real. The stock price was real. The reputation was real. Few people imagine that a system can be both wealthy and deceptive at the same time. But employees were not the only ones who believed. The people paid to be skeptical believed as well. In the late 1990s, America was living through a unique moment. The internet was exploding. New technology companies seemed to appear every day. Investors believed the future was being rewritten before their eyes. In that atmosphere, Enron told a perfect story. At its core, Enron was an energy company. Its roots were tied to pipelines and energy trading. But the company rarely described itself that way. It talked about platforms. It talked about data. It talked about technology. It talked about the future. It was exactly the story the era wanted to hear. When a stock continues rising year after year, skepticism becomes much harder. Nobody wants to be the only person in the room suggesting that everyone else may be wrong when the entire market is making money. The person raising warnings often appears to be standing in the way of progress. The fear of being left behind is one of the most powerful forces in financial markets. It can push even intelligent investors to follow the crowd. The more major institutions invested in Enron, the more comfortable others became. If a major bank was involved, surely it had done its homework. If a large investment fund had committed money, surely it knew something positive. If a respected analyst recommended buying the stock, there must be a reason, layer by layer. Those endorsements created a network of collective belief. Many people thought they were evaluating Enron through objective data. In reality, they were influenced by herd psychology just like everyone else. Yet the market still had one final line of defense: the people hired to verify the truth. That responsibility belonged to auditors and oversight mechanisms. The problem was that this protective system carried weaknesses of its own. The accounting firm responsible for reviewing Enron's financial statements was also receiving substantial consulting fees from the same client. When a business relationship becomes valuable enough, asking uncomfortable questions becomes increasingly difficult. The more dependent you become on a client, the greater the pressure to keep that client happy. At the same time, Enron's financial structures became increasingly complicated. Special purpose entities, derivatives, future value accounting methods, transactions kept off the balance sheet. Many of these structures were entirely legal when used appropriately. The difficulty was that they were combined in ways that made it extraordinarily difficult to see the complete picture. Asking questions was not only time-consuming, it could also lead to lost clients, lost revenue, and lost competitive standing. A strange paradox emerged. The people hired to protect the system were operating inside a system that often encouraged them to avoid conflict. Even so, there was a larger reason than all the others combined. The reason why not only employees, not only investors, not only auditors, but an entire era believed in Enron. Enron was not really selling natural gas. Enron was selling the future. The 1990s were a period when America believed innovation could overcome almost every traditional limitation. The internet was changing how people communicated. Technology was creating new billionaires at unprecedented speed. Society began to believe that every industry could be reinvented. Enron understood that. Step by step, the company transformed itself into a symbol of the future. It did not want to be viewed as a traditional energy company. It wanted to represent a new era. That reputation was reinforced year after year. The company was celebrated for innovation, studied as a model of modern management, treated as a new standard of success on Wall Street. The most dangerous thing about Enron was that it never looked like a scam. It looked like genius. It wore expensive suits. It appeared on major financial networks. It was discussed in business classrooms. It was praised in prestigious magazines. It possessed nearly every signal society typically uses to identify legitimate success. That is what made it far more dangerous than ordinary fraud. Enron did not collapse because of a single mathematical error. It did not collapse because of one leaked email. It did not collapse because of one individual. It collapsed because too many people chose not to ask questions. It collapsed because visible success was treated as proof of truth. It collapsed because, for a long time, Profit made skepticism seem expensive. That is the greatest lesson left behind in the ruins of Enron. At a large enough scale, fraud no longer resembles a clumsy lie. It takes the shape of innovation. It takes the shape of the future. It takes the shape of the very thing society most wants to believe is real. And when an illusion is protected by an entire system, the last person to see the truth is often the one who ends up paying for it.